Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor, please subscribe if you haven't already. Gather round, bookworms, because the time has come for a new episode of Rock and Read. Today, we will finish up Runnin With The Devil, written by Van Halen's manager, Noel Monk. The amount of positive feedback that I've received about this book has been phenomenal. Views are through the roof, and I can't thank you enough for that. You guys have been really eager to hear each chapter, and I hope it lived up to the hype. Now, let's check out the last chapter. In January 1985, I got a call from Alex. I figured this wasn't a great sign, as I had heard very little from him or Edward in recent months. Most of my time was devoted to David, who had returned from the Monsters of Rock tour and immediately began developing his solo career. He worked every day with me and Peter Angelus on developing a plan for his EP. As for the other guys, well, they never came to the office, so my entire life, from a business standpoint, was now centered around David Lee Roth. It was, to say the least, depressing. More than once I found myself thinking, what am I doing here? I mean, the money was good. Thanks to 1984, Van Halen was still generating vast revenue, but I was enormously frustrated and bored out of my mind. Van Halen, as an active musical entity, had almost ceased to exist. And the guys were so difficult to manage. Sometimes I'd catch myself thinking about what it had been like 7 years earlier, or even 3 years earlier, when they were straight, or at least half straight, and still hungry and playful, and I'd be overcome with melancholy. Van Halen should have been the biggest band in the world, but it wasn't. It was a band on hiatus, a band with no direction. David Lee Roth and Edward Van Halen were seminal figures in the world of hard rock, and now they were barely speaking to each other. And when they did speak, they didn't speak politely. They had different interests and different goals. In a sense, they were like parents going through a divorce. They just didn't know it. And I was like a kid caught in the middle. A call from Alex was one of the many dominoes that would fall in the ensuing months. I could tell by the tone of his voice that he was uncomfortable, the way someone sounds when they're making a call that they've been avoiding for some time. "Hey Noel, we have to do some business," Alex said. "Sure thing, Al. What did you have in mind?" There was a long pause. "Well, I'd like you to come with me to meet with our accountant. We're going to go over the books together." Holy! My heart began racing. Not because I feared the discovery of any illicit activity. I knew I could account for every penny that passed through our organization, but simply because of what this represented. The first step, and an obvious one, toward having me removed as manager. It was a fairly standard tactic. Try to prove financial malfeasance, rather than admit you simply want to replace your manager because you'd rather work with someone else. I was intimately familiar with this strategy, but tried not to let on. "Sure, Al, no problem." The next day, Al picked me up, and we drove together to the office of our accountant, Michael Carlin, who had been working with us for years. When I got there, I was somewhat surprised, although not shocked, to see that Alex had invited Valerie Bertinelli's financial advisor, who was now apparently consulting for Edward, and Alex too. This could have been a sticky situation, but I knew that I had truth and honesty in my favor. By the time I got there, Michael had everything laid out. Expenditures and profits on touring, merchandising, record sales, everything. And as he and the money man went over the figures, it became apparent that there wasn't so much as a nickel out of place. Not only that, but when the numbers stare at you in that way, they don't lie. "Wow, you guys have done really well," Michael said. The money man nodded in agreement. Hal just sort of sat there looking bewildered and vaguely unhappy. I'm not sure exactly what he expected would come out of this meeting, but he couldn't have thought that they'd be placing a gold star on my forehead. Yet, that's basically what happened. We made uncomfortable small talk on the drive home. As I got out of the car, Hal smiled and thanked me for my time, as if an unnecessary financial review, which by nature is accusatory and threatening, was no big deal. I bit my tongue and said, "Anytime, Al, don't worry about it." As he drove away, I muttered under my breath, "You little..." The writing was on the wall by now, and I decided to go down swinging. 7 years into my tenure as the manager of Van Halen, I still didn't have a legitimate contract. Just the same old month-to-month deal under which I had labored since 1978. Every time I thought about this, it made me angry. I had gotten them out of a onerous contract with their record label and negotiated a new and lucrative contract that pushed the band to a place of prosperity and prominence. Financially speaking, we had all done very well. But I had no financial security, and after seeing what the guys had done to Michael Anthony, I knew I had to at least try to protect myself. I had my personal attorney write a formal request to the band asking for a new and long-term contract on my behalf. I didn't demand anything unreasonable, just the same share I had always received. What I wanted was security, to ensure, for example, that I wouldn't suddenly be cut out of the proceeds from merchandising, a venture I had started and turned into one of the most profitable parts of the Van Halen brand. I didn't ask for a greater percentage or anything. I simply asked for a real contract, one that reflected the industry standard. 7 years, guaranteed. That way, at least, I'd be protected. If Van Halen wanted to replace me with a new manager, they'd have to buy out my contract. That much I had earned. But the protection would not kick in until after I had a signed contract. Under the current arrangement, I could be terminated at any time, for any reason, on 30 days' notice. So if they viewed my overture as threatening or ungrateful or simply an impediment to doing what they really wanted to do, which was to hire a new manager, as it stood, they could simply swat me out of the way. I knew this. I understood the risks, but I figured I was on my way out anyway, so I had nothing to lose. Maybe, I thought, this will prompt a period of reflection, followed by appreciation. Or not. The truth is, I had lost Van Halen. More important, they had lost themselves. I referred to them only half-jokingly as a DEA band. Drugs, ego, alcohol. I really wondered how it had all fallen apart. Van Halen in 1978 had all the promise in the world, and the hunger to make good on that promise. They had the most gifted and innovative guitar player I had ever heard. They had a brilliant front man, and they had a good drummer and a good backing bass player. Competent musicians who understood their supporting roles and played them well. It didn't matter that Alex wasn't John Bonham or that Michael wasn't John Entwistle. They didn't need to be. They simply had to show up and keep time. More than anything else, a bass player and a drummer must be in sync. On that level, Michael and Alex were perfect. They were right for each other and for Van Halen. Without Van Halen? Well, my personal opinion is that both Michael and Alex would have struggled. Gifted artists abound in the music business. Some of the very best are unknown to the layperson simply because they spend most of their time in the studio doing session work as independent contractors. These guys neither need nor want the headache and stress that comes with being part of a band, the touring and the bickering and the endless struggle to break through on a major scale. Instead, they go to a comfortable studio every day and work with an eclectic mix of artists. They're handsomely compensated because they know how to do the job right every time. They live relatively stress-free lives. They want to keep it that way. Thank you very much. They're also insanely talented and completely reliable. In sum, they are consummate professionals in every sense of the word. Alex and Michael might have found the session world somewhat challenging, but as long as they were under the umbrella of Van Halen, they were protected. They were solid musicians who found the perfect vehicle and became superstars. I felt bad that Michael had been pushed to the periphery, and I worried about what might become of him without Van Halen. I had a harder time working up much sympathy for Alex. While 3/4 of Van Halen sat around waiting for divine inspiration, David Lee Roth proceeded, like a force of nature, with his plans to release a solo EP. To put it mildly, this was not the type of venture that David's fans would have anticipated, but it was very much in keeping with the sample he had played for me on the Concorde several months earlier, and in fact did not stray far from the flamboyant cabaret act that had long been trying to break through David's hard rock exterior. The 4-song EP, Crazy from the Heat, was released on January 28th, and almost instantly became a polarizing entry in the Van Halen/David Lee Roth canon. Many fans hated it. Some found it interesting and fun. For David, though, the EP's primary purpose was not to placate or even entertain the legions of Van Halen fans, but rather to broaden his own audience and expand upon his brand by trying something different, while simultaneously recording the kind of music that he actually liked. David was into high-energy party music, and not just of the pop-metal variety. He was a big fan of Motown, for example, as his personal mixtapes often reflected. On that level, there is no denying that Crazy from the Heat was an unqualified success. Critical response might have been lukewarm at best, but the EP was embraced by top 40 radio stations and fans alike. These things go hand in hand, spawning 2 hit singles and popular videos that propelled the EP to platinum status. In other words, David Lee Roth had very quickly positioned himself as a bona fide superstar solo act. A campy, cheesy solo act to be sure, but I don't think that bothered him in the least. The David who pranced around beaches in the video for California Girls? The guy who strutted about playfully while crooning a Louis Prima-inspired melody of Just a Gigolo and I Ain't Got Nobody? That guy was the real David Lee Roth. A great many Van Halen fans might have found this version of Diamond Dave repellent, but I honestly think it was liberating for him to finally unleash his inner lounge singer. And while I hated every song on its EP, even as I promoted the out of it, there's no arguing with success. Whether David had deliberately sabotaged Van Halen or merely planned properly and judiciously for a post-VH future, he had successfully taken the next step toward independence, and had done it in a fashion that was at once shameless and sly. Consider, for example, the winking third-person reference. I'm just a gigolo, and everywhere I go, people know the part Dave's playing. Or did they? Was this just a temporary version of David? An experimental side project to fill the time between Van Halen projects? Or a big fat feather boa of a to the band that had made him a household name? If it was the latter, David never let on. Whenever he was interviewed, and that happened a lot during the 6 months after the release of Crazy from the Heat, he repeatedly insisted that his heart still belonged to the band from Pasadena. He was merely flexing his creative muscles, trying to avoid typecasting, because Diamond Dave doesn't like to be put in a box. Or some such nonsense. Who the knows? I was with David all the time in those days, and I had trouble separating the sincerity from the guy was impenetrable. In some ways, it was easier to deal with Alex, whose alcoholism could make him angry, vindictive, and manipulative, but also rather transparent. David was much harder to read, which is why I did not know what to make of the call I received from David in early February 1985. Most of my conversations with David in those days naturally revolved around his solo career, but this time he wanted to talk about Van Halen. He said the band wanted to have a meeting with me. The topic, he said, was my role as Van Halen's manager. The guys want to talk about the offer you made, he said. Is that okay? I said that it was, and suggested we had the meeting at my house, since it was easier than going to our office in L.A. David said, fine. Before he hung up, however, he informed me that Michael would not be part of the meeting, since he was no longer a full partner. Okay, I said, trying to sound calm, though for some reason, that small piece of news struck me as ominous, but not nearly as pretentious as what he said next. No, I have to tell you something, he said. You'd better watch out for Al. Really? I said, feigning surprise. Yeah, I can't tell you any more than that. Just be careful. Now, you might reasonably ask why David would give me any advance notice about what was to come, and the answer was simple. At the same time that my departure was being engineered by Al, David was planning his own exit, and frankly, he wanted me to be part of that strategy. He figured if I was fired by Van Halen, I'd be eager to help orchestrate his career. In other words, he was sort of working both sides of the street. A more generous reading of the situation would be that David honestly felt we were friends, which only speaks to how deluded he really was. The next day, we got together at my house. Al and Edward drove over together, while David, as usual, rode his bicycle. It was the first time in several months that I had been in the same room with Alex, Edward, and David. It was probably the first time the three of them had been in a room together. It felt weird to be conducting official band business without Michael present, but clearly the parameters of our organization had changed. We were no longer a family. We were a business entity that was breaking apart. It's funny the way certain events in your life become not just memories, but something closer to archival footage, forever playing on a loop in your mind's eye. All you have to do is press play. Sometimes you don't even have to do that. The video just starts on its own, whether you want to relive it or not. And it never loses clarity. I can still see Alex and David sitting together on my sofa, Al appearing grim, and David looking like he wanted to run out of the room. I see Edward lying on the floor directly in front of them, his eyes glassy as usual, but his ever-present smile strangely missing. Edward used to remind me of Pigpen, the Peanuts character forever surrounded by a cloud of dust. In Edward's case, the cloud was white. As he shifted his weight from one arm to the other, tiny little puffs of white powder rose like talcum from his shirt. He was obviously high, but not happy. But then, happy was a word that rarely applied to Van Halen at that time. For what seemed like an eternity, we sat there in silence, no one willing to get the meeting started. I felt like I was hosting my own execution in my own home. So, what the? Why not just pull the trigger myself? Okay, boys, I began. What have you decided? They all exchanged glances. Obviously, they hadn't developed a strategy for the meeting. To my surprise, Edward spoke first. You know I love you, right, Noel? And I'll always want you around, to be part of this. I shrugged. Thanks, Ed. What does that mean? Edward looked at the floor, then at his big brother. Ed's reaction was so sad and weak that I almost felt bad for him. On cue, Alex assumed the role of enforcer. No, here's the way it is. We're not going to give you a long-term contract. There was a pause, an opening for me to speak, but I opted to remain silent. I didn't want to make this any easier for Al or for any of them. Moreover, I had nothing to say. If this was indeed my execution, I would not go down screaming and crying. I would leave the world of Van Halen rather stoically. In fact, Alex continued, we're not giving you a contract at all. We've decided we're not going to give you any of the merchandising. We're not giving you any of the publishing. We're not giving you any royalties or touring revenue. All we want you to do is book our tour. Another long pause as Alex waited for me to say something. I did not. I just stared at him. Noel, he finally said, we're getting new management. I had been staring hard at Al, but the sound of someone trying to catch his breath caught my attention. I looked at David. There were tears rolling down his cheeks. Come on, Dave, get a grip. I'm not sure what was going through David's mind at that moment. The silence in the room eventually prodded Al into offering a few vague and feeble reasons for my dismissal. It's time for a change, we want to move in a new direction, that sort of thing. The only specific thing he mentioned regarding my performance was his disappointment over losing the Spark-O-Matic endorsement to Supertramp. I didn't even have time to respond to that bit of nonsense. David beat me to it. That wasn't Noel's fault, he said, his voice hiccuping through his tears. That was my fault. Get up. Alex gave David a hard and quizzical look, and I realized then that Alex was hearing the news for the very first time. Holy God! David never told them what really happened. Anyway, water under the bridge, or over the dam, or wherever it is the water goes when the damage is done. It might have been nice for David to demonstrate some accountability before they had decided to can the manager, but I'm not sure it would have made much of a difference. There were personal factors in play here that rendered any reasonable arguments about performance superfluous. That much was obvious. The contract I negotiated on their behalf had doubled the band's income, and would continue to do so for many years. Apparently, that had been forgotten. So too had the fact that these guys weren't even interested in a merchandising venture until I put it all together for them and showed them how much money we could make. And now, they were going to cut me out of that very same business, as if I had had nothing to do with it? This was a very cold room indeed. After all I had done for Van Halen, after dedicating my entire life to the band for the previous 7 years, I was left with virtually nothing. I was no longer the band's manager. I wasn't even the road manager. The small and meatless bone they tossed my way was a meager stipend to book their next tour and then get the out of the way. In retrospect, it seems incredible, and yet at the time, I wasn't even surprised. As much as I disliked Al by then, he was the only member of the group behaving somewhat like a grown-up in this particular meeting. David sat on the couch with his face buried in his hands, unable to speak after coming clean about the Spark-O-Matic endorsement. And Edward, prone on the floor, hung over and up, he could barely muster anything more than utter passivity. Ed, would you care to weigh in on any of this? I said at one point, though I'm not sure why. I guess it's because Edward was the one member of the band for whom I had always felt genuine affection. On some level, I wanted to hold him accountable for what was happening, but Ed was much too weak and too far gone to get involved. Whatever Al wants, he said, his eyes brimming with tears. I can't fight with him anymore. A few minutes later, it was over. The last thing I said as I walked them to the door was, "It's been a pleasure, guys." There was no response, just a nod from Alex and muted sniffling from both Edward and David. As the boys walked away, Jan came out of our bedroom. We stood together and watched out the front window. For a moment, they stopped at the end of the driveway and began talking to each other. The conversation quickly became animated. It looked like David and Alex were arguing, although I can't be sure. But it ended quickly. David hopped on his bike and pedaled away, and the brothers Van Halen got into their car and drove off into the California sunset. I never spoke with any of them again. Well, we've reached the end of the book. What was your favorite part of Runnin' with the Devil? Let me know in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.